This is a talk about some very promising developments in an unexpected place, in Irish agriculture. And since I'm going to say some promising things about a place where many of you, by an understandable reflex, think that only neutral to worse things can be said, let me start at the beginning by saying that this is optimism, but not crazy optimism. Not going to say that all the problems have been solved. Certainly not going to say that the methane problems have been solved. But together with my co-authors, Rory O'Donnell and Larry O'Connell from NESC, I am going to argue that in water quality and water regulation, there have been dramatic advances in reconceptualizing the problem and in building institutions that look like they are actually addressing it. Not conclusive, but this is a famously intractable problem. Improving runoff, the use of nutrients and runoff is a problem that has bedeviled the world for almost as long as there has been worry about climate change. And the idea today is to suggest that advances in this area are deeply relevant to thinking about a chunk of the rest of climate change and thinking generally, though I'm not going to do that, about how you build a general climate change regime that could start with Paris. I'm afraid I'm less optimistic about Paris than some, not that it's a bad thing, it's a wonderful thing, but Paris is a starting point. It's very far from an end point, and in order to fill it out, you need other ideas of institution building and governance, and the claim is that this is an ingredient. So I'm going to just outline areas, 4 areas, in production, in certification, in environmental regulation, where there have been, and in Chaggis's work with policy formation linked to extensionism, I'm going to show you a set of convergent changes, concordant and convergent changes. Same kinds of change in 4 different areas, which are not only mirror each other, but converge and intertwine to form the beginning of a new regime, which is a model for other regimes. Let me add one more word of context. The minister said today, toward the end of his talk, that he had an idea based on the jobs plan for how to achieve effective climate change mitigation. And it had the institutional part, the getting it done part, had 3 elements. The first was everybody should know that Leo is watching, that Taoiseach is on your case. He's aware of this. Don't get caught out. Don't do bad things. The second thing is direct accountability. People who have responsibility for implementing policies should implement them and be accountable if they don't. And the third thing was, and we're not just going to blindly execute the plan. We know that we're fallible, we make mistakes, and every year or periodically, in short intervals, we're going to revise the plan. Those are 3 great ideas. And the question is how you do all 3 at the same time. Because if you go through the first cycle and discover that a lot of stuff isn't working, and of course it's not going to work because you don't know at the beginning of these extremely complex things, with all the uncertainty that's involved, exactly what's going to work at the beginning. If you get to the end of the first period and a lot doesn't work, you might say, okay, we don't know, let's stop, or what are we going to do next? And the only way you can continue going forward with those same 3 pillars or points of reference is if during the interval you're learning continuously about what to do next, about what's working and what's not working. So in the background, you need a system that can do that can learn as you go what's working and not working so you can adjust the plan. That's the first point. Second point is that system isn't just about individuals responding. Because people said, so the last session somebody said, we need clear targets so people know what to do and what to expect. And that's really understandable. Because not having clear targets is really a bad idea. But there's a problem if you only rely on targets. If individuals have individual incentives, they solve the problems that are within their individual capabilities. But these are deeply social collective problems. You don't need to be told that. And you can't incentivize everybody all at once, so you need some system that incentivizes action generally, makes people unable to sit still and wait, but encourages people to act collectively and learn collectively. So continuous collective learning, and if somebody put that on a slide and said, oh, I have a system that does that, your understandable response would be, give me a break. So I'm not going to do that. I'm going to show you how such a system is actually emerging in Irish dairy agriculture. So
I think you need to use the arrow thing there. Oh, it's not there anymore.
oh, no, I figured out, you don't want to know. There's a subtle interaction between Keynote Live and your system that wasn't anticipated. Exactly my point. There are a lot of unanticipated things. So the argument is that in the 4 domains, production, standard setting, environmental regulation, policy making, there are these convergent, intertwined responses. And more specifically, in each domain, there is a movement from top-down prescription, from people writing rules, to thinking that the reason to write rules and to have general scientific ideas is to focus investigation at a lower level, closer to the ground, about what's really going on. Okay? It's not that people say rules are bad, science is bad, general ideas are bad. That's crazy. But they are saying there is a complexity, there is an idiosyncrasy in environmental and many other affairs that eludes general rules. So we have to look at the very local level in order to figure out how things interact so we can make them work. So another way to say that is that rules and standards and so on shift from being a prescription that you follow to a rebuttable presumption. The place where you start until your experience tells you there's a deviation and you have a good reason, you have to be able to explain it. It's not just you didn't feel like continuing. You need a good reason to explain why you're doing something different. And of course, your reasons for doing something different indicate alternative or possible solutions. Okay, so let's just skip. And the key idea here is that these very abstract ideas are actually being embodied in institutions that are emerging in agriculture, in dairy agriculture in particular. They're emerging in a lot. I don't want to make it sound, I mean, it would be wonderful if I could say Ireland, unique of all places on earth, the only place. This stuff is going on a lot. It's going on all over, sort of. It's inconspicuous because people just do it. They don't give it a name. So this is a name for new things that people are doing in a lot of places that address core issues of collective learning under uncertainty that you need for environmental issues generally. Okay, so here are the strands. Certification through Board BIA, Origin Green, and there are some questions about that one. Managing catchment level water, which is EPA and Chagas. Precision dairy, and which I'll explain in case you're not a dairy farmer, and lean production, which may be more familiar and maybe not, and then MAC curves, science, a way of ranking, a kind of familiar way of ranking, ranking policy alternatives, a kind of a sophisticated form of cost-benefit analysis that's widely used in environmental discussions. And in all four domains, you see this shift. You see this shift from top-down to understanding that top-down has to be corrected by experience and bottom-up. So the first one, and in some ways the most ambiguous, for a reason that I'll say in a second, is Board BIA. So Board BIA, you know, Origin Green. The origin of Origin Green is very straightforward. Every economist in the room will understand, and everyone who's ever bought an insurance policy will understand in a second. Ireland, around 2010, starts to think sustainable dairy is the economic way of the future. If we can present ourselves as the most credible, most productive, lowest carbon, highest quality producer of sustainable dairy products, we will have an extremely valuable niche in world markets. Turns out to be true. The precondition for that in a small economy is that no small group of producers huddling under the shadow of the general brand dislodge consumer confidence, cause people to doubt the probity, the reliability of the other producers by doing bad stuff. So you need some system for certifying that people are complying, and Origin Green is that system. It's a standard setting regime focused on sustainability, and it's the first one such national standard in the world. So it's a kind of, with all its limitations, it's an interesting thing, and it itself, just as a standard, keeps ratcheting up so that more and more people are covered. It's a very high coverage rate now. The relevant farmers is 90%, and co-ops are starting to offer or basically penalize people for not meeting the standard. And farmers who don't meet the Origin Green standard are under social pressure from their neighbors because everyone understands this is potentially bad for all, okay? So that's a standard. But Origin Green is, at least conceptually, and Michael will have a lot more to say about this, is going much further than that. Because almost from the beginning, as it was becoming a standard in the sense that I just described, Origin Green was adding a lot more information to the information collected from audits. So it was taking the audit information and integrating it with information from the movement index, and in other words, cow by cow information about the life of and ingestion of individual animals. And it was combining it with information about calving rates from the Breeders Association, and so on and so forth. So there is a huge database, invaluable, that takes the audit information to show that you're complying with the Origin Green standard with these other databases, and together they're a potential source of continuous improvement for individual farmers. So that goes, and with a view towards sustainability. And Michael can tell us how much of that, the potential is undoubtedly there. When we speak to people, some say it's being used and others say it's there and it will eventually be used. And the question is what's happening with it. So honestly, we don't know. But it's interesting that and important that the data that nobody thought, I think nobody thought, that the audit itself should be the end point. There's an understanding that it's necessary to go to beyond that. Organizing that is difficult. Okay. The integrated water management is in some ways the core of this. Because this is a story of trying to seize success from the jaws of repeated failure. It's not a happy story, but it's a story with a potentially very happy ending. So this is a story of, as many of you probably know, the Water Framework Directive starts about 2009, and there are 6-year cycles, and each country is required to submit a river basin management plan, which covers the various river basins within its territory or shared jointly with other member states of the EU, and you show how you're going to mitigate damage to the water quality, the chemical composition, thermal composition, biodiversity of various types of water bodies within each basin. And that's done, and Ireland did it, and the results were not good. And so Ireland was under substantial pressure to improve its performance, and that pressure in the long term has induced a bunch of changes. That's the first thing. The second thing, under the Nitrate Directive, I'm going to come back to the significance of the Nitrate Directive, which deals with fertilizers and so on. It is a condition of accessing the Common Agricultural Funds. Individual farmers have to submit mitigation plans, and the mitigation plans are also not working very well. So there's obligations. The obligations, this is a very good use of goals and standards. Obligations are set. They're open-ended. I mean, basically the requirement is to improve, and Ireland is definitely not even meeting the requirement to improve. In other words, you don't get into a lot of trouble if you just don't improve a huge amount. You have to be improving. Disimproving is not good. So Ireland disimproves, or anyway, doesn't hit the minimum targets, and is under substantial pressure. And the first response, not a dumb response, the first response in Ireland, and it persists through this, from then basically to the present, is to find out what happened. Okay, this is really important. Ireland's DAFM, known familiarly as the Agricultural Department, I guess, at least in the United States, DAFM starts a program with Teagasc to look into things at the catchment level. There's a bunch of catchment areas are selected, and there's much more intensive monitoring. And the monitoring is designed, it's continuous, it's high frequency because there are pulses of emissions of pollutants that you don't detect if you're not measuring very frequently. So you need a much more rigorous approach to figure out where the problems are that explain the non-compliance. Not easy, and the catchment program, the Agricultural Catchment Program, ACP, looks into variations in soil type, variations in subsoil type, and variations in the underlying geology, just to give you an idea. So that's a lot of variation for what looks superficially at the surface of the earth in the field, like the same kind of field with the same P level, potassium level. Underneath, there are radically different formations and constellations of formations, and the combination of these different soils, subsoils, subjacent structures, geological structures, go a long ways to explaining differences in the pattern of absorption and drainage. So things that look the same at the surface have very different behaviors. And once you start to dig into that, you realize that in some ways it's an endless story. Not that you're not learning very important things about, you could make a typology of different soils crossed with different subsoils, crossed with, scientists like this kind of thing, and the human mind likes this kind of thing. But the idea that you're going to get a comprehensive table of all possible soil types, subsoil types, geologies, and so on and so forth under different climatic variation conditions in Ireland is nuts. So people come to two conclusions. One, huge amount of local idiosyncrasy, irreducible, And the result is that when you make a plan, a basin management plan or a nutrient management plan, you have to make it more precise and actionable, effective, by adding ongoing local consultation with the people who are actually closest to the land, have subtle forms of local knowledge that escape these other forms of measurement, and can have ideas about mitigation that might be unavailable just at a high level of inspection. So that means at a minimum, they're going to need assistance. They're going to need a new type of assistance from Chagos advisors, let's say, who are equipped not just to tell farmers what the current best practice is, what the best package of technology is today for their type of cultivar or of herd, but rather work with them to carry forward this investigation or to call on other colleagues in science units related to Chagos or in Chagos and the EPA, and call on those units and get the necessary information to complement the initial review. Okay, so the report disavows one size fits all. It says you're going to need assistance no matter what. And there are some interesting cases that still, need digging into, but you begin to see what the possibilities are. Timoleague, West Cork, there were 6 catchment areas in this program. One of them was a dairy area. The one you might think would be the most burdened. The dairy area is the one where the farmers worked most intensively with the Chagos advisor, and through the Chagos advisor with science units who are soil experts and so on. And those farmers were the ones in the study who were most able to lower high phosphorus level fields and raise low phosphorus level fields. So they were in complete control. Now, the minute you turn to nitrogen, other problems, and eutrophication, there are problems of the influence of climate. Nobody is saying, let me just repeat in case somebody missed it the first time around, no one is saying the problem is solved. But it's this, just making the little P indicator go up and down the way you want is very, very, very hard to do. Now, there's one little imponderable here. The farmers in Timoleague are very good. They pay high rents, they're making a bunch of money, so they're good farmers. And they're young and they're highly educated. Dairy farmers tend to be well educated. And so we don't know how much of this is due to the fact that these are crackerjack farmers as opposed to the advice. But, and I mention these things because I want you to understand it's easy to rocket ahead and say, case solved, do it. But you need to know that this stuff is hard-won knowledge. Okay, so there are a bunch of institutional innovations. Institutions come last. People do stuff, they figure out what starts to work, and then they redesign their institutions. And then when they're done with that, they call the lawyers, or the administrative lawyers, or the politicians, and they say, look, take a look. Okay, you got this. This works, and the good politicians and the good lawyers, the good administrative people, they jump on it. I'm one of those guys. I go around looking for people who have done these things, and then I just shine a light. That's the function of the people who are doing this stuff are the ones who really do figure it out. So. In this case, the EPA goes and it's under pressure again from the pesky European Union, those guys. Their, Water Framework Directive, you're really not doing so well. Your governance could be, we could tweak that up. And by the way, people have to participate in this. It's not clear the EU people fully understand how much the local knowledge, they get this at a very general level, but nobody has a model for this. They don't come and they say, here, the Bulgarians are doing it, or the Germans are doing it, because not only are the Bulgarians not doing it, the Dutch and the Danes are not doing it. You guys are doing it. okay? So there's no model that everybody says you got to do this. The EPA has started to build a very interesting model, and the model has, I'm not going to describe that because it's like that's a thing in itself. There's a cascading process to get to 190 problem areas, zones that have to be addressed. And it goes from national to regional to local with back and forth with various corrections. And that intersects with a new set of institutions at the local level called, very appealingly, LawPro. LawPro. Local, you know, it doesn't matter. The name, it used to be LawCo, now it's LawPro. It's the local authorities entity that responds to, that supports the process of local assessment of the final list of locally relevant problems. So from the 190, some of the 190, that's the national number, a certain number they're not allocated, a certain number fall in each the jurisdiction of each local authority. Each local authority then actually helps organize a local catchment assessment where the stakeholders who are involved in the problem walk around with other stakeholders. It's quite a complicated process of how that all comes to be, but the effect is that all the involved stakeholders actually are talking to each other about the local problems, what to do about them, the responsibilities, and so on and so forth. And it's a necessary corrective and complement to the national definition of the problems. Okay, so it's a very thoughtful, complex mechanism. And yesterday we were talking to Sean Keating and his team, and it's under constant evolution, which is itself a good sign. But there's no question that Ireland has committed itself to a very thoughtful, participatory process of defining where the problem areas are based on the best science, and then integrating that with deep community participation at the local level where the problems have to be addressed.
Joe, could you try and get through the last couple?
Yes, I will. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to skip precision agriculture, and I'm just going to mention, I'll let you look at the Chagas. So there's a similar shift from top down to rethinking the function of science with Chagas. And as I mentioned at the beginning, there's this idea of the marginal abatement cost curve, which is this device for ranking policy alternatives. And here's the quote that you should just read. This is from a recent scientific paper by the Chagas team that's ranking policy alternatives, and this is the conclusion of the science is that the science serves as the jumping off point for informing local deliberation. So there's no more thoughtful, crisp statement of the overarching thrust of this set of transformations than a kind of conclusive statement of this kind. Okay, so let me very quickly add in a piece. So the message so far is that you run into unsolved problems. You discover that you're unthinkingly omitting the local context from decision making. You start to build institutions that add back the local context. When you add back the local context, when you say we're going to contextualize, you also say that you're going to collaborate. Because when you say, I did the best I can with the knowledge I have, now I need somebody else's knowledge as a complement to that, that's an invitation to collaborate. It's an invitation to collaborate with other organizations. It's an invitation to collaborate with local people. Okay, and then you might think collaboration and contextualization is the whole story. I've told this story with only minimal reference to, for example, the EU in the background. But it's really important to understand that though this is a story about the increasing importance of local initiative and the collaboration, ongoing mutual correction between the local levels and higher levels, none of this would have happened without the firm commitment by the EU, political will, to make it really difficult for people just to stick with the status quo. If people had not been told, whatever you do, you can't just keep doing what you're doing. If you do that, there's going to be some vague draconian penalty, which is effective because it's vague and because it's potentially draconian. So draconian, you think, okay, I don't want that. I'll start doing something, and I see what I find, and that's the experience in Ireland. So, last thought. It's not the whole story, but this is the beginning of a very big piece of the story. And the suggestion is that the world could learn a lot. That's my own interest in this. The world can learn a lot from this apparently small thing, not small to the people involved and certainly not small to you, but at the macroscopic level, this small thing of the notable successes of EPA and environment and in this one domain in Ireland. The world can learn a lot from that. But conversely, Ireland probably has a ton to learn from its own successes in water for thinking about GHG gases and climate change generally. And, I'm not going to go into this, from things that are the most successful climate change regimes in the world, like the Montreal Protocol for avoiding ozone depletion. Those tend to work on the same principle. So there you are. It happened. These are things that have happened in the shadows. Now, in the spirit of Eleanor Roosevelt, time to light a candle so everybody can see them. Thanks.